The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as hundreds of military personnel gathered for what should have been impossible: a memorial service for someone who was about to crash her own funeral. But Sarah Chun didn't know that yet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At that very moment, she was 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, piloting an experimental F-22 Raptor through classified airspace, racing against time to prevent a catastrophe that would claim thousands of lives. The woman the Air Force had declared killed in action 12 years earlier was about to make an entrance that would rewrite military history and shatter everything her family, friends, and former squadron believed about life, death, and the impossible. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the cramped break room of Henderson Technical Solutions, casting harsh shadows across peeling linolexum floors that had seen better decades. Elena Martinez wiped grease from her hands with a paper towel. That disintegrated on contact, leaving black smears across her calloused palms. The industrial clock on the wall read 6:47 a.m., which meant she had exactly 13 minutes before her shift officially began. Though she'd been here since 5:30, troubleshooting a network problem that had stumped the day shift technicians for 3 days running. At 36, Elena possessed the kind of anonymity that came from years of deliberate practice. Her dark hair, streaked with premature silver, stayed pulled back in a practical ponytail that never drew attention. The khaki uniform shirt hung loose on her small frame, deliberately sized up to minimize any hint of femininity in an environment where being noticed often meant being targeted. Her brown eyes, once described by a flight instructor as having the intensity of laser guidance systems, now stayed carefully downcast during interactions with supervisors and coworkers who saw her as nothing more than another pair of hands to fix their computer problems. The break room door swung open with its characteristic squeal, admitting Kevin Thompson, the morning shift supervisor whose greatest achievement in 15 years of federal employment was perfecting the art of appearing busy while accomplishing nothing. Thompson carried himself with the swagger of someone who confused authority with competence. His government-issued polo shirt stretched tight across a belly that spoke of too many taxpayer-funded lunches and not enough actual work. "Martinez," he called out, though she was the only other person in the room, "got another crisis for you. Building 7's entire network is down, and they're screaming about some classified briefing that's supposed to happen at 9. Think you can handle it, or should I call in someone from the main office?" Elena had learned long ago that Thompson's passive-aggressive challenges were tests designed to reinforce the hierarchy that kept him feeling important. She could have fixed Building 7's network remotely in 15 minutes, but admitting that level of competence would only create problems. Instead, she nodded quietly and gathered her toolkit, a collection of diagnostic equipment that looked standard issue, but had been carefully modified with components that would make Pentagon cybersecurity specialists very nervous if they knew what they were looking at. The walk to Building 7 took her across the sprawling complex of Langley Air Force Base, though technically she worked for a civilian contractor that provided technical support to various military installations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days maintaining the same computer network she'd once helped design, back when her security clearance was so high that even acknowledging its existence required special authorization. Now she carried a basic maintenance badge that granted access to utility closets and server rooms, the digital equivalent of janitorial work. The morning air carried the familiar sounds of military aviation, the distant roar of jets taking off. For training missions, the rhythmic whop of helicopter rotors, the controlled chaos of an active airfield. Each sound triggered memories that Elena had spent 12 years learning to suppress. Muscle memory of pre-flight checks and combat maneuvers that existed in her hands and heart, despite every effort to forget them. She paused for a moment outside. Building 7, watching a pair of F-22 Raptors taxi toward the runway, their angular profiles cutting through the Virginia morning like predators awakening from sleep. Building 7 housed the 94th Fighter Squadron's administrative offices, a maze of cubicles and conference rooms where the real work of military aviation happened. Briefings, mission planning, paperwork that turned tactical decisions into official policy. Elena's contractor badge granted her access to the building's technical infrastructure, but explicitly prohibited her from entering any spaces where classified information might be discussed. The irony of this restriction would have been amusing if it weren't so painful. The network problem turned out to be exactly what she'd suspected, a cascading failure caused by a router configuration that had been implemented by someone who understood protocol theory but lacked practical experience with military-grade security requirements. The kind of mistake that happened when theoretical knowledge met real-world applications without the bridge of hands-on expertise. Elena could have prevented this particular failure 8 different ways, but doing so would have required explaining how she knew things that a civilian contractor shouldn't know. She worked methodically through the diagnostic process, her fingers moving across keyboards with the unconscious precision of someone who'd once programmed targeting computers under enemy fire. The network architecture unfolded in her mind like a 3-dimensional map, each connection point and data pathway as familiar as the streets of her childhood neighborhood. Within 45 minutes, she had isolated the problem, implemented a temporary fix, and designed a permanent solution that would prevent similar failures in the future. The squadron's personnel began filtering into the building as Elena finished her work, pilots and support staff preparing for the day's missions with the casual efficiency of professionals who'd performed these routines thousands of times. She recognized the rhythm of military preparation, the subtle dance of individuals coordinating into a unified force. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What struck her most was how young they all looked. These pilots who carried the responsibility of America's air superiority on their shoulders. When she'd been their age, flying combat missions over hostile territory, she'd felt ancient with the weight of command. Now watching them through the server room's glass door, she felt like a ghost observing a world she'd once inhabited. Major Patricia Hayes, the squadron's executive officer, appeared in the server room doorway with the harried expression of someone juggling too many critical tasks simultaneously. Hayes was Elena's age, but where Elena had learned to make herself invisible, Hayes commanded attention through sheer competence and presence. Her flight suit was immaculate, her bearing confident, her eyes sharp, with the intelligence that had earned her a position of responsibility in one of the Air Force's most elite units. "Are we back online?" Hayes asked without preamble. "The briefing starts in 20 minutes, and the colonel will have my head if we can't access the mission files." "Networks restored," Elena replied, keeping her voice neutral and professional. "I've implemented a temporary patch, but you'll want to schedule a full system upgrade within the next month to prevent recurrence." Hayes studied Elena with the assessing gaze of someone trained to evaluate potential threats and assets. "You fixed this pretty quickly." Thompson said the day shift had been working on it for 3 days. Elena shrugged, a gesture that had become second nature whenever her competence threatened to draw unwanted attention. Sometimes a fresh perspective helps. Different approaches to the same problem. What Elena didn't mention was that she'd designed similar network architectures for forward operating bases in Afghanistan, hardening them against electronic warfare attacks that could cripple air support operations. She'd written portions of the cybersecurity protocols that governed how classified information moved through military networks, back when her recommendations carried the weight of operational necessity rather than contractor suggestions. As Hayes hurried away to prepare for her briefing, Elena began packing her diagnostic equipment with the methodical care of someone who'd learned that careless habits could have fatal consequences. The server room's climate control system hummed quietly, maintaining the precise temperature and humidity levels necessary for optimal computer performance. She'd helped design similar environmental controls for server farms in classified locations, systems that kept critical intelligence networks operational in conditions ranging from desert heat to Arctic cold. The irony of her current situation had lost its sharp edge over the years, worn smooth by daily repetition like a stone polished by flowing water. Elena Martinez, civilian contractor, was paid $42,000 a year to maintain computer networks that Captain Sarah Chun had once helped design when her annual salary exceeded 6 figures and her security clearance granted access to information that could reshape global politics. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but through a careful process of legal documentation, identity reconstruction, and deliberate anonymity that had taken 3 years to complete and 12 years to perfect. Sarah Chun had died officially on March 15th, 12 years ago, when her F-22 Raptor had been shot down over North Korean airspace during a classified reconnaissance mission that officially never happened. The aircraft's wreckage had been photographed by satellite. The crash site confirmed by signals intelligence. The pilot's fate sealed by the impossible odds of survival in hostile territory with no possibility of rescue. The memorial service had been held at Arlington National Cemetery, attended by military leadership, congressional representatives, and a family who'd been told that their daughter's service to her country required that certain details remain classified forever. What the official records didn't reflect was that Captain Sarah Chun had ejected successfully from her damaged aircraft, evaded capture for 16 days in mountainous terrain, and eventually made contact with intelligence. Assets who'd offered her a choice that would define the rest of her life. The mission she'd been flying when shot down had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military command. A network of officers selling classified information to foreign governments for personal gain. Sarah's survival and the intelligence she'd gathered made her simultaneously the most valuable witness and the most endangered person in military custody. The choice had been presented to her in a sterile briefing room at a location she'd never been allowed to identify. Testify against the conspiracy and face almost certain assassination, or disappear completely and let the guilty parties believe they'd succeeded in silencing her. The intelligence community would handle the conspiracy through other means, slower but safer methods that wouldn't require her testimony. In exchange for her silence and disappearance, she'd be given a new identity, financial support, and the knowledge that her sacrifice had prevented information from reaching enemy hands that could have cost American lives. Sarah had chosen to disappear, though the decision had torn apart everything she'd believed about duty, honor, and justice. Captain Sarah Chun died in that briefing room as surely as if she'd perished in the wreckage of her F-22, leaving behind Elena Martinez, a woman with carefully constructed credentials in computer network administration and a background detailed enough to pass routine background checks but shallow enough to discourage deeper investigation. The transformation had required more than just paperwork and new identification documents. Sarah had been a fighter pilot, trained to command attention, to make split-second decisions that affected the lives of others, to project authority and confidence in situations where hesitation could mean death. Elena had to learn the opposite skills: how to blend into backgrounds, how to defer to authority figures she could outthink and outperform, how to suppress instincts honed by years of combat training and command responsibility. The physical changes had been the easiest part. Sarah's regulation military haircut grew out into longer styles that could be worn in civilian fashions. Contact lenses changed her eye color from green to brown. Careful attention to posture and movement patterns eliminated the unconscious bearing that marked someone with military training. Even her handwriting changed. The precise block letters of military documentation replaced by the casual script of someone who'd never filled out classified mission reports. The emotional changes had been far more difficult. Sarah had defined herself through achievement, excellence, and the respect of her peers. Elena had defined identity in anonymity, purpose in thankless work, satisfaction in problems solved without recognition. The pilot who'd once briefed congressional committees on air superiority tactics learned to nod quietly when supervisors explained basic concepts she'd helped develop. The officer who'd commanded million-dollar aircraft learned to feel grateful for steady employment fixing network problems. But the most challenging aspect of her new existence was the isolation. Sarah had lived in a world of shared purpose, surrounded by people who understood the weight of responsibility and the bonds forged by common danger. Elena worked alongside civilians who'd never faced life or death decisions, who measured success in performance evaluations and annual raises, who couldn't comprehend the kind of sacrifice that had shaped her former life. She couldn't share memories of combat missions, couldn't reference experiences that had defined her worldview, couldn't maintain relationships with people who'd known her before the transformation. The loneliness had been manageable during the first few years, when the novelty of civilian life and the relief of survival had sustained her through the adjustment period. But as the years passed and the immediate threat that had necessitated her disappearance faded into historical context, Elena began to question whether the price of safety had been worth paying. She watched from the sidelines as her former squadron mates advanced in their careers, earned promotions, received recognition for achievements that she could have equaled or exceeded. She read about military operations where her expertise could have saved lives, prevented failures, contributed to successes that might have changed the course of conflicts. The morning briefing in Building 7 concluded with the familiar sounds of organized departure, chairs scraping across floors, conversations continuing into hallways, the purposeful movement of people transitioning from planning to action. Elena finished her network diagnostics and prepared to return to the contractor office, but paused when she heard Major Hayes mention a name that sent ice through her veins. "Colonel Vincent Morrison will be joining us for the afternoon briefing," Hayes was saying to someone in the hallway. "Pentagon wants his assessment of our readiness protocols before the new deployment cycle begins." Elena's hands stilled on her diagnostic equipment. Vincent Morrison had been a captain 12 years ago, one of the officers whose names had appeared in the classified intelligence that led to her disappearance. She'd never learned the full scope of the conspiracy that had threatened her life, but Morrison's involvement had been confirmed by sources she'd trusted with her life. The fact that he'd not only avoided prosecution, but risen to the rank of colonel, suggested that the network of corruption had been more extensive and resilient than anyone had anticipated. The realization that Morrison would be in the same building, breathing the same air, discussing operations with people who had no idea of his true nature, triggered responses that Elena had spent 12 years learning to control. Her pulse accelerated, her breathing shallowed, her hands began to shake with the fine tremor that came from adrenaline flooding her system. The instincts that had kept her alive in combat situations were screaming at her to assess threats, identify escape routes, prepare for confrontation. Instead, Elena forced herself to breathe slowly and deeply, to pack her equipment with steady hands, to walk calmly toward the building exit as if she'd heard nothing more significant than routine administrative announcements. But her mind was racing through implications and possibilities, calculating risks and options with the tactical awareness that no amount of civilian conditioning could completely suppress. Morrison's presence at Langley suggested that his influence had grown rather than diminished over the past 12 years. The conspiracy that had forced her into hiding might have evolved, adapted, found new ways to profit from classified information while maintaining the appearance of legitimate military service. The intelligence community's promise to handle the situation through other means had apparently failed to eliminate the threat, leaving corrupt officers in positions where they could continue to endanger national security. As Elena walked across the base toward her contractor office, she found herself automatically noting security cameras, guard positions, and patrol patterns with the unconscious awareness of someone trained in operational security. The habits of a former intelligence officer were reasserting themselves despite years of deliberate suppression. Muscle memory responding to perceived threats with tactical thinking that felt both familiar and dangerous. The contractor office occupied a converted storage building on the edge of the base, a collection of cubicles and workbenches where civilian technicians maintained the unglamorous infrastructure that kept military operations functioning. Elena's workspace was deliberately unremarkable: a standard desk, a basic computer terminal, a few family photos that showed people she'd never met, but whose images helped establish her fictional background. The photos had been carefully selected from stock photography websites, showing groups of people at family gatherings, graduations, vacations that Elena could describe in detail because she'd memorized the backstories that accompanied her constructed identity. Kevin Thompson was waiting by her desk with the expression of someone who'd been looking forward to delivering unwelcome news. His satisfaction was barely concealed as he handed her a work order that would consume the rest of her day, with routine maintenance tasks designed more to assert authority than accomplish anything productive. Building maintenance wants a full diagnostic of the backup server systems, Thompson announced with the tone of someone assigning punishment detail. Should keep you busy until close of business. And Martinez? He paused, clearly enjoying the moment. Try to remember that we're support staff here. Our job is to fix problems quietly and efficiently, not to impress the military personnel with how clever we are. Elena accepted the work order without comment, though she wondered what had prompted Thompson's reminder about appropriate behavior. Perhaps Major Hayes had mentioned Elena's quick resolution of the network problem. Or maybe Thompson was simply reasserting dominance after being reminded that his own technical knowledge had limitations. Either way, the message was clear: stay invisible, stay quiet, stay in the designated role of interchangeable contractor. The backup server room was located in the basement of the administration building, a climate-controlled space filled with racks of equipment that hummed with electronic purpose. Elena had always found comfort in server rooms, spaces where problems had logical solutions and competence produced measurable results. The complexity of network architectures appealed to the same part of her mind that had once calculated intercept courses and missile guidance parameters, though the stakes were considerably lower when dealing with data transmission rather than air-to-air combat. As she began the diagnostic routine, Elena's thoughts kept returning to Vincent Morrison's unexpected presence at Langley. The coincidence seemed unlikely given the security protocols that governed officer assignments and base access. Morrison's visit was probably related to some legitimate military function, but Elena's intelligence training had taught her to distrust coincidences and look for patterns that might reveal deeper connections. The backup servers contained historical data going back several years, including archived communications, mission reports, and personnel files that painted a detailed picture of the 94th Fighter Squadron's operations. Elena's contractor access was supposed to be limited to technical maintenance functions, but her background in cybersecurity had taught her methods for accessing information that existed within systems without triggering security alerts. She told herself that she was simply being thorough in her diagnostic work, but she knew she was really looking for any mention of Morrison's visit or its purpose. What she found was more disturbing than she'd expected. Morrison's access requests showed that he'd been granted permission to review classified mission files dating back 15 years, including operations from the period when Sarah Chun had been active. The official justification was routine security assessment, but Elena recognized the pattern of someone searching for specific information rather than conducting general oversight. Morrison was looking for something particular, and Elena's experience suggested that he was probably looking for any trace of evidence that might have survived from the conspiracy that had forced her disappearance. The implications were staggering. If Morrison was still actively involved in intelligence trafficking, his access to current mission files could compromise ongoing operations and endanger personnel currently deployed in hostile areas. If he was searching for information about Sarah Chin's mission, he might have reason to believe that she'd survived and could still pose a threat to whatever network had replaced the original conspiracy. Either possibility suggested that Elena's carefully constructed anonymity might not be as secure as she'd believed. Elena spent the remainder of the afternoon conducting legitimate diagnostic work while her mind processed the potential threats and options available to her. The server maintenance provided familiar comfort, the logical progression of testing and verification offering temporary refuge from more complex problems. But even routine technical work couldn't completely distract her from the growing realization that her 12-year exile might be approaching an end, whether she was ready for it or not. As the workday concluded and the base settled into evening rhythms, Elena made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She would attend tomorrow's briefing where Morrison was scheduled to appear, not as Elena Martinez, the contractor, but with the observational skills and tactical awareness of Captain Sarah Chun. She needed to assess whether Morrison's presence represented a direct threat to her safety or simply an unfortunate coincidence that could be managed through continued vigilance. The drive to her apartment took her through suburban neighborhoods where civilian families lived lives of comfortable routine. Their concerns centered around mortgage payments, school events, and weekend plans rather than national security threats and international conspiracies. Elena had tried to embrace this kind of existence, to find satisfaction in simple pleasures and everyday achievements. But tonight the contrast between civilian normalcy and the dangerous realities she'd once navigated felt more pronounced than ever. Her apartment reflected 12 years of deliberate ordinariness, modest furniture purchased at discount stores, decorations chosen for their generic appeal rather than personal meaning, bookshelves filled with titles that supported her contractor background rather than revealed her true interests. The only personal touches were carefully selected items that reinforced Elena Martinez's fictional history while concealing any trace of Sarah Chen's actual past. But hidden behind a false panel in the bedroom closet, Elena maintained a small cache of items that connected her to her former identity: photographs from her military service, copies of commendations and fitness reports, technical manuals from aircraft she'd once flown, and a secure communication device that could contact intelligence handlers who'd promised to maintain protective oversight despite her official death. She'd never used the device, partly from fear of compromising her safety and partly from uncertainty about whether the people who'd arranged her disappearance were still in positions to help her. That night, Elena sat in her darkened living room, considering options that ranged from immediate flight to confrontational engagement. Morrison's presence at Langley might be coincidental, but her survival instincts suggested otherwise. The intelligence community had promised that the conspiracy threatening her would be handled through other means. But 12 years of Morrison's continued advancement suggested that those other means had been insufficient or incompletely implemented. The secure communication device represented both her greatest hope and her most dangerous option. Contact with her former handlers could provide information about current threats and available support, but it would also confirm that Elena Martinez was connected to intelligence networks in ways that would destroy her carefully constructed civilian identity. The decision to break 12 years of silence would be irreversible, transforming her from a protected witness hiding in plain sight to an active participant in whatever conflict had survived from her former life. As midnight approached and Elena weighed possibilities against consequences, she realized that tomorrow's observation of Morrison might provide the information she needed to make more informed decisions. If his presence at Langley was truly routine, she could continue her cautious existence as Elena Martinez while maintaining enhanced vigilance. If his visit suggested active threats to her safety or ongoing damage to national security, she might need to consider options that would end her exile and return her to a world she'd left behind 12 years ago. The choice ahead felt familiar, in its weight and consequence, reminiscent of the moment in that sterile briefing room when she'd chosen disappearance over testimony. But Elena was no longer the same person who'd made that decision 12 years ago. She'd learned patience, discretion, and the value of careful observation. If circumstances forced her to act, she would do so with the wisdom gained from 12 years of watching and waiting, combined with the skills that had once made her one of the military's most effective pilots and intelligence operatives. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of aircraft and missions, of decisions that shaped lives and futures that hung in the balance of split-second choices. Elena woke before dawn with the clarity that often followed difficult nights. Her mind focused on the day ahead and the questions that needed answers. Whatever Vincent Morrison's true purpose at Langley, she would observe, evaluate, and prepare for possibilities that might range from continued hiding to active engagement with threats she'd thought safely buried in the past. The woman who'd learned to be invisible was about to rediscover what it meant to see clearly, and what she saw might force her to choose between the safety of shadows and the dangerous clarity of light. The morning of Colonel Morrison's briefing arrived with unseasonable fog rolling across Langley Air Force Base, reducing visibility to mere yards and casting the entire installation in an ethereal haze that seemed to muffle sound and distort familiar landmarks. Elena arrived at the contractor office earlier than usual, her nerves demanding the comfort of routine while her mind raced through scenarios and contingencies that had kept her awake most of the night. The fog felt appropriate, somehow as if the weather itself was reflecting the uncertainty that shrouded her carefully constructed world. Kevin Thompson was already at his desk, nursing his third cup of coffee and scrolling through maintenance requests with the sluggish attention of someone whose motivation peaked around Tuesday of most weeks. His greeting to Elena carried its usual blend of condescension and casual authority, though she detected an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested he was looking forward to something beyond the normal tedium of administrative oversight. "Martinez, you've got special duty today," Thompson announced with barely concealed satisfaction. "Building 7's hosting some big shot from the Pentagon, and they want extra tech support standing by during the briefing. Apparently your network fix yesterday impressed someone upstairs, so congratulations on being voluntold for VIP duty." Elena felt her pulse quicken even as she maintained the carefully neutral expression that had become second nature over 12 years of hiding. The assignment placed her exactly where she needed to be to observe Morrison, but it also increased her exposure to scrutiny from military personnel who might possess the training to notice details that civilian supervisors would miss. The irony wasn't lost on her that Thompson's petty desire to assert authority had inadvertently granted her access to precisely the information she needed. "What kind of support are they expecting?" Elena asked, keeping her voice level while her mind began calculating risks and opportunities. "Standard stuff," Thompson replied with a dismissive wave. "Babysit the presentation equipment. Make sure the network doesn't crash during whatever classified dog and pony show they're running. Just remember to stay invisible and keep your mouth shut. Pentagon types don't appreciate input from the help." The walk to Building 7 took Elena through the heart of the base, past hangars where maintenance crews prepared aircraft for morning training flights and operation centers, where mission planners coordinated exercises that would test pilot skills and equipment capabilities. The fog created an almost surreal atmosphere, transforming familiar structures into shadowy outlines that emerged and vanished like ghosts from her past. She found herself automatically noting security positions and patrol patterns, Old habits reasserting themselves as her body prepared for possibilities her mind hadn't fully acknowledged. Major Hayes met Elena at Building 7's entrance, her demeanor more focused and intense than during their previous interaction. The executive officer's attention to detail was evident in everything from her immaculate uniform to the precise organization of files tucked under her arm, suggesting that today's briefing carried significance beyond routine administrative functions. "Martinez, good timing," Hayes said briskly. "We've got a full house today, and the presentation system has been acting temperamental all week. I need you to monitor everything from the tech booth and be ready to troubleshoot any problems that come up. This briefing cannot experience technical difficulties." Elena nodded her understanding while privately noting the stress markers in Hayes's voice and posture. The major was nervous about something more than just equipment reliability, which suggested that today's meeting involved stakes higher than typical Pentagon oversight visits. As they walked through the building's corridors toward the main briefing room, Elena caught glimpses of unusual activity: additional security personnel, communications specialists setting up encrypted transmission equipment, and staff officers whose rank insignia indicated involvement in high-level operations planning. The briefing room itself was a study in military precision, with rows of chairs arranged in perfect alignment, facing a presentation area equipped with multiple display screens and classified communication terminals. The technical booth occupied a raised platform at the rear of the room, positioned to provide clear sight lines to all equipment while maintaining separation from the main briefing area. Elena settled into the booth's operator position, familiarizing herself with control systems that were more sophisticated than typical base infrastructure, suggesting that Building 7 hosted briefings involving information requiring enhanced security protocols. As the morning progressed, personnel began filtering into the briefing room with the measured cadence of a well-rehearsed process. Elena recognized most of the 94th Fighter Squadron's officers, along with several faces from other units whose presence indicated that today's agenda extended beyond single squadron concerns. The conversation she could overhear consisted primarily of professional small talk and routine coordination, but she detected an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested everyone understood they were participating in something more significant than ordinary training briefings. At precisely 1000 hours, Colonel Vincent Morrison entered the briefing room with an entourage that immediately commanded attention. Elena's first glimpse of him in 12 years triggered a flood of recognition and suppressed anger that she struggled to control. Morrison had aged well, his hair showing distinguished silver at the temples, and his bearing radiating the confidence of someone who'd never faced serious consequences for his actions. His uniform displayed ribbons and decorations indicating continued advancement and recognition, a visible reminder that the conspiracy that had destroyed her life had apparently enhanced his career. Morrison's speaking voice carried the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to commanding attention and deference. As he began his presentation on readiness assessment protocols, Elena found herself analyzing his words for hidden meanings and implications that might reveal his true purpose at Langley. The official briefing covered standard topics: training schedules, equipment readiness, personnel evaluations, and coordination requirements for upcoming deployment cycles. But Elena's intelligence training allowed her to identify subtle indicators that suggested Morrison was fishing for specific information rather than conducting routine oversight. The questions Morrison posed to squadron personnel revealed a pattern of interest in historical operations, particularly missions involving advanced aircraft and experimental equipment. He inquired about pilot qualifications for classified programs, security procedures for handling sensitive intelligence, and protocols for managing personnel who might have access to compartmentalized information. To most observers, these would appear to be legitimate areas of concern for a Pentagon oversight officer. To Elena, They suggested someone attempting to identify potential security vulnerabilities or personnel who might possess knowledge of past operations. During a brief intermission, Elena observed Morrison engaging in conversations with individual officers that appeared casual, but followed patterns she recognized from intelligence gathering operations. He was building profiles of key personnel, identifying their backgrounds, relationships, and access levels to information that could be valuable to hostile intelligence services. The realization that Morrison was conducting recruitment assessment rather than readiness evaluation sent cold fear through Elena's system while simultaneously triggering analytical processes that had been dormant for 12 years. Major Hayes approached the technical booth during the break, ostensibly to check on equipment status, but clearly seeking Elena's assessment of the morning's proceedings. The Major's intuitive awareness that something felt wrong about Morrison's visit aligned with Elena's professional evaluation, suggesting that Hayes possessed the kind of operational instincts that made effective officers valuable assets and dangerous targets. "Everything functioning properly up here?" Hayes asked, though her tone indicated she was asking about more than just technical equipment. "All systems operating within normal parameters," Elena replied carefully, using language that could carry multiple meanings depending on the listener's level of sophistication. Hayes studied Elena with the assessing gaze of someone trying to solve a puzzle without all the necessary pieces. "You seem pretty familiar with military briefing procedures for a contractor. Previous experience?" The question was casual but probing, indicating that Hayes had noticed behavioral indicators that suggested Elena's background included more than routine technical training. Elena felt the familiar tension between maintaining her cover story and engaging with someone whose professional competence she respected and whose safety might depend on accurate information about Morrison's true nature. "I've worked defense contracts for several years," Elena answered, staying close to the truth while avoiding specifics that might trigger deeper investigation. "You pick up certain patterns when you're around military operations long enough." Hayes nodded, though her expression suggested she remained curious about Elena's obviously deep familiarity with protocols and procedures that most civilian contractors would find unfamiliar. The conversation was interrupted by Morrison's return to the podium for the afternoon session, but Elena could sense that Hayes's interest in her background had been piqued in ways that could prove either helpful or dangerous depending on how future events unfolded. The afternoon briefing focused on upcoming exercises and deployment preparations, topics that should have been routine but which Morrison approached with the same pattern of probing questions that had characterized the morning session. Elena began documenting his areas of interest, noting the specific programs and personnel that drew his attention most consistently. A clear picture was emerging of someone attempting to identify opportunities for intelligence exploitation within current military operations. The breakthrough came during Morrison's discussion of overseas deployment security protocols. His questions about communication procedures and information handling requirements revealed knowledge of operational details that exceeded what would be available through normal Pentagon channels. Elena recognized references to classified programs and security measures that had been implemented after her disappearance, suggesting that Morrison had maintained access to highly sensitive information throughout the 12 years since she'd been presumed dead. More disturbing was Morrison's subtle interest in memorial and commemoration procedures for personnel killed in action. His questions about how the military handled classified information belonging to deceased officers seemed to be probing for weaknesses in protocols designed to protect sensitive materials from unauthorized access. Elena realized with growing alarm that Morrison might be searching for traces of intelligence that Captain Sarah Chun had gathered before her supposed death, information that could still pose threats to whatever network had replaced the original conspiracy. The technical booth's position provided Elena with clear audio of all conversations in the briefing room, including side discussions that Morrison probably assumed were private. During one such exchange with a communications officer, she overheard him inquiring about procedures for accessing archived mission data and personnel files from historical operations. The specific time frame he mentioned corresponded exactly to the period when Sarah Chun had been active, confirming Elena's suspicion that his visit was related to her former identity rather than routine oversight functions. As the briefing progressed, Elena found herself automatically reverting to intelligence analysis patterns that had been suppressed for 12 years. She began building psychological profiles of Morrison's associates, identifying their roles in whatever operation he was, conducting and assessing their potential threat levels to her continued safety. The familiar mental processes felt both comfortable and dangerous, reminding her of capabilities she deliberately abandoned, but which might now be necessary for survival. The most significant revelation came near the end of the afternoon session, when Morrison made what appeared to be a casual comment about upcoming memorial events. He mentioned that Arlington National Cemetery was hosting several commemoration ceremonies for personnel killed in classified operations, including some cases where families had waited years for official recognition of their loved ones' sacrifices. The timing he referenced matched perfectly with plans Elena had seen mentioned in official notifications about a memorial service scheduled for the following week. Elena's blood turned to ice as she realized the implications. If Morrison was referencing Captain Sarah Chun's memorial service, it meant that the military was planning to finally acknowledge her death publicly, probably as part of a broader ceremony honoring classified operations that could now be partially declassified. The service would bring together everyone who had known Sarah Chun professionally and personally, creating the perfect opportunity for Morrison to gather intelligence about her former associates while maintaining the cover of paying respects to fallen comrades. Worse still, Elena understood that her own curiosity about Morrison's presence had placed her in extraordinary danger. If he was indeed searching for traces of Sarah Chun's intelligence gathering, her behavior over the past 2 days might have already attracted attention from surveillance assets she hadn't detected. The technical skills she demonstrated, her familiarity with military procedures, and her obvious interest in Morrison's briefing could all be interpreted as indicators that Elena Martinez possessed background knowledge inconsistent with her contractor identity. The realization that she might already be under suspicion triggered survival instincts that had kept her alive during her original escape from hostile territory. Elena began planning immediate contingencies while maintaining the appearance of routine technical support, her mind racing through extraction procedures and escape routes that she'd hoped never to need again. The secure communication device hidden in her apartment represented her only reliable connection to protective assets, but using it would confirm Morrison's suspicions about her true identity. As the briefing concluded and personnel began departing, Elena faced a decision that would determine whether her 12 years of careful hiding had been sufficient preparation for the confrontation that now seemed inevitable. Morrison's presence at Langley was not coincidental, and his interest in Sarah Chun's memorial service suggested that Elena's past was about to collide with her present in ways that would test everything she'd learned about survival, sacrifice, and the true cost of justice. Major Hayes lingered after most participants had departed, ostensibly organizing materials, but clearly observing Elena's behavior as she secured the technical equipment. The Major's professional instincts were telling her that something significant had occurred during the briefing, though she lacked the context to understand exactly what she'd witnessed. Elena realized that Hayes might represent either a valuable ally or a dangerous complication, depending on how much truth she was prepared to reveal about her background and Morrison's true nature. "Interesting briefing," Hayes commented as Elena completed her equipment shutdown procedures. "Colonel Morrison certainly had a lot of detailed questions about our operations." Elena paused in her work, recognizing an opportunity to gauge Hayes' own assessment of Morrison's behavior without revealing her suspicions directly. He seemed particularly interested in historical operations and security procedures. Is that typical for Pentagon oversight visits? Hayes studied Elena with renewed attention, clearly recognizing that the question demonstrated analytical thinking beyond what would be expected from a routine contractor. Not really, she admitted. Most oversight visits focus on current readiness and future capabilities. Morrison's interest in past operations was unusual, especially his questions about personnel who might have had access to classified programs. The admission confirmed that Hayes had also detected suspicious patterns in Morrison's questioning, suggesting that Elena might not be the only person who'd recognized the colonel's true agenda. The possibility that a serving officer had independently identified threats to operational security offered both hope and additional complexity to Elena's assessment of available options. As they walked together toward the building exit, Elena made a decision that balanced truth with necessary caution. Major, hypothetically speaking, what would you do if you suspected that someone conducting oversight might have ulterior motives for gathering information about classified operations? Hayes stopped walking and turned to face Elena directly, her expression reflecting the gravity of what was being suggested. Hypothetically, I'd want to be very certain about my suspicions before making accusations that could destroy careers and compromise legitimate operations. But if I had credible evidence of security breaches or intelligence gathering by unauthorized personnel, I'd have a duty to report those concerns through appropriate channels. Elena nodded, understanding both the offer of potential support and the warning about consequences of unsubstantiated allegations. Hayes was indicating her willingness to take action if provided with sufficient evidence, but she was also making clear that such action would require proof that could withstand official scrutiny. The challenge was providing that proof without revealing Elena's own background in ways that would compromise her safety or her carefully maintained civilian identity. Hypothetically, Elena continued, what if the person with concerns about unauthorized intelligence gathering had knowledge that couldn't be revealed through normal channels without compromising other security interests? The question hung between them like a bridge spanning dangerous territory, offering connection, but requiring trust from both sides to cross safely. Hayes's response would indicate whether she possessed the judgment and courage necessary to handle information that could reshape her understanding of threats facing her squadron and her service. Hayes considered the question for a long moment, clearly recognizing its implications and the responsibility it placed on her shoulders. Hypothetically, I'd say that protecting legitimate security interests sometimes requires unconventional approaches to gathering and presenting evidence. If someone had knowledge that could prevent damage to national security, I'd be willing to explore creative solutions for acting on that information while protecting necessary confidentialities. Elena felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension. Hayes was indicating her willingness to work within gray areas of protocol and procedure if necessary to address genuine threats, but she was also acknowledging that such cooperation would require Elena to reveal at least some truth about her background and knowledge. The prospect of trusting someone else with information that could destroy her carefully constructed new life felt terrifying, but the alternative might be allowing Morrison to continue operations that could endanger current military personnel and compromise ongoing missions. If I were to suggest that we continue this hypothetical conversation in a more secure environment, Elena said carefully, would you be willing to listen to information that might change your assessment of Colonel Morrison's visit? Hayes studied Elena's face with the intensity of someone trying to read classified intelligence from subtle indicators and behavioral cues. Whatever she saw there convinced her that Elena's concerns were based on more than civilian speculation or paranoid theories about military activities. There's a secure conference room in Building 12 that's swept daily for surveillance devices, Hayes said quietly. If you have information that bears on squadron security, I'm prepared to listen and evaluate it according to its merits rather than its source. Elena understood that Hayes was offering her the chance to present evidence about Morrison's activities, without immediately revealing her true identity, though such a presentation would inevitably raise questions about how a civilian contractor had acquired knowledge of intelligence operations and security threats. The offer represented both an opportunity and a point of no return, after which Elena's anonymous existence would be permanently altered regardless of how events ultimately developed. As they parted company outside Building 7, Elena realized that the fog had begun lifting, revealing the sharp edges of buildings and aircraft that had been softened by morning haze. The metaphor felt appropriate as her own situation emerged from the obscurity that had protected her for 12 years into the harsh clarity of choices that would determine not only her own fate, but potentially the safety of people she'd once sworn to protect. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of routine, maintenance tasks that Elena performed automatically while her mind processed the implications of her conversation with Hayes and the intelligence she'd gathered about Morrison's activities. The secure communication device hidden in her apartment seemed to pulse with possibility and danger, representing connection to protective assets that might already be compromised by 12 years of institutional changes and personnel turnover. Evening found Elena sitting in her car in the parking lot of a suburban restaurant, staring at a phone number she'd memorized 12 years ago but never used. The communication protocol required a specific sequence of calls and responses that would identify her to handlers who might not even remember that Captain Sarah Chun had ever existed. The risk of exposure was enormous, but the alternative might be allowing Morrison to continue operations that could cost lives and compromise national security interests that transcended her personal safety. Her finger hovered over the phone's keypad as she weighed consequences against responsibilities, personal survival against professional obligations that had shaped her identity long before she became Elena Martinez. The woman who'd learned to be invisible was about to step back into the light, and she wasn't certain whether what awaited her there would be salvation or destruction. The decision, when it came, felt both inevitable and terrifying. Elena dialed the number and waited for an answer that would either confirm her fears or provide the support she needed to prevent Morrison from succeeding in whatever operation had brought him to Langley. The conversation that followed would determine whether 12 years of hiding had prepared her for the confrontation that now seemed unavoidable, or whether she was about to discover that some enemies were more patient and persistent than even her worst nightmares had suggested. As darkness settled over the Virginia suburbs and Elena drove toward an uncertain future, she understood that tomorrow would bring choices that could reshape not only her own existence, but the lives of everyone who'd trusted her judgment during her years of service and sacrifice. The ghost who'd haunted military installations for 12 years was about to become real again, and the consequences of that transformation would test everything she'd learned about courage, loyalty, and the true meaning of duty to something larger than personal survival. The secure phone rang 3 times before a voice answered with the neutral tone of someone trained never to reveal more information than absolutely necessary. Elena's hands trembled as she spoke the authentication codes she'd memorized 12 years ago, wondering if the words still carried meaning in whatever intelligence apparatus had evolved during her absence from official existence. Nightingale 77, requesting emergency contact with Shepherd Station, she said, using call signs that felt both foreign and familiar on her tongue. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elena began to suspect the communication protocols had been changed or abandoned entirely, leaving her exposed and alone with knowledge that could destroy her. "Stand by for verification," the voice finally responded, followed by electronic tones that Elena recognized as encrypted transmission protocols. Several minutes passed before the voice returned, now carrying a different inflection that suggested the call had been transferred to someone with higher authority and deeper access to classified information. Nightingale 77, this is Shepard Actual. Your authentication is confirmed. Though we show you as in active status since March 2013, state the nature of your emergency. Elena felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension as she realized that her former handlers had maintained her contact information despite her official death. The fact that they'd responded to her emergency codes suggested that protective protocols remained in place, though she couldn't be certain whether those protections extended to the current situation or had been compromised by 12 years of institutional changes. Shepard Actual. I have credible intelligence that the original threat vector remains active and may be targeting current operations. Request immediate assessment of compromised status and available protective measures. The pause that followed. Her transmission felt endless as Elena imagined encrypted communications racing through networks that connected her suburban parking lot to decision-makers who might not remember why Captain Sarah Chun had been important enough to protect. When Shepard Actual responded, his tone carried the urgency of someone who understood exactly what Elena's reappearance might signify. Nightingale 77. Maintain current position and await contact from protective assets. Do not return to your residence or workplace until you receive further instructions. Consider your cover potentially compromised and act accordingly. The call ended with electronic silence that left Elena staring at her phone in the gathering darkness of a Virginia evening that had suddenly become far more dangerous than any she'd experienced since her escape from hostile territory 12 years ago. The instruction to avoid her apartment and workplace confirmed her worst fears about Morrison's true purpose while simultaneously validating her decision to seek help from handlers who'd promised to maintain protective oversight despite her official death. Elena drove through suburban neighborhoods with the heightened awareness of someone who understood that survival might depend on detecting surveillance or threats that could emerge from any direction. Her route followed patterns designed to reveal following vehicles while avoiding predictable destinations that might allow hostile forces to anticipate her movements. The skills that had kept her alive during 16 days of evasion in enemy territory felt both rusty and surprisingly intact as muscle memory guided decisions about speed, direction, and route selection. The shopping center where she finally stopped offered multiple exit routes and enough ambient activity to provide concealment while she waited for contact from assets whose current capabilities and loyalties remained unknown. Elena positioned herself in a coffee shop with clear sight lines to the parking lot and entrance, ordering a drink she didn't want while scanning faces and behaviors for indicators of professional surveillance or hostile intent. 27 minutes after her arrival, a woman approached Elena's table with the casual confidence of someone conducting a pre-arranged meeting. Middle-aged and unremarkable in appearance, she could have been any suburban professional grabbing an evening coffee, except for eyes that missed nothing and movements that suggested extensive training in situational awareness and threat assessment. Elena Martinez? The woman asked, using a voice that carried just enough volume to be heard without attracting attention from nearby customers. I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Department of Veterans Affairs. We need to discuss your recent inquiry about benefit eligibility. Elena recognized the approach as standard tradecraft for initial contact in potentially hostile environments, establishing plausible reason for conversation, while allowing both parties to assess threats and authenticity before proceeding to sensitive topics. She nodded her agreement and followed Walsh to a corner table that provided privacy while maintaining visual access to potential escape routes. Your emergency transmission triggered several interesting reactions, Walsh said quietly, after they'd settled into positions that allowed both women to monitor the surrounding environment. Some people who'd assumed you were permanently out of the picture are suddenly very concerned about what information you might have retained and who you might have shared it with. Elena felt ice form in her stomach as the implications of Walsh's statement became clear. Her contact with former handlers had already generated responses from hostile forces, confirming that Morrison's presence at Langley was connected to ongoing intelligence operations rather than routine oversight activities. The network that had forced her into hiding 12 years ago had apparently maintained surveillance capabilities that could detect when protective assets were activated on her behalf. How compromised is my current situation? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew. The answer from Walsh's expression and the urgency of the contact protocols that had brought them together. Walsh glanced around the coffee shop with the automatic awareness of someone trained to detect surveillance before responding with the kind of brutal honesty that characterized professional intelligence communications. Your contractor identity was solid until you made contact tonight. The authentication process required accessing databases that are monitored by parties who have strong interests in ensuring that certain people remain permanently silent. Your emergence from deep cover has already triggered responses that suggest active threats to your safety. Elena absorbed this information while calculating options that ranged from immediate flight to various forms of engagement with threats she'd hoped to avoid forever. The knowledge that her carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered by her own attempt to seek protection felt like a devastating irony, but she understood that inaction might have led to even worse consequences if Morrison's operation succeeded in compromising current military personnel or ongoing missions. What about protective assets? Elena asked. Are the original arrangements still in place? Or has 12 years of institutional change eliminated the people who promised to maintain oversight? Walsh's expression shifted to something that might have been regret mixed with professional assessment of difficult realities. The original oversight structure was compromised approximately 8 years ago when several key personnel were transferred or retired under circumstances that suggested their loyalties had become questionable. Current protective capabilities are limited and may not be sufficient to address the level of threat your reappearance has generated. The admission that Elena's safety net had been systematically dismantled during her years of hiding confirmed her worst fears about the persistence and evolution of the conspiracy that had forced her disappearance. The network that had sold classified information to hostile governments had apparently grown stronger rather than weaker over time, adapting to changing circumstances while eliminating threats to their continued operations. However, Walsh continued, recent developments have created opportunities for addressing threats that weren't available when you first went into hiding. New personnel in key positions, changes in oversight procedures, and growing awareness of systemic corruption have made it possible to take actions that would have been impossible 12 years ago. Elena leaned forward slightly, recognizing the tone of someone preparing to present options that would require careful consideration of risks and potential benefits. The fact that Walsh was offering possibilities rather than simply arranging Elena's immediate extraction suggested that current circumstances might allow for more aggressive responses to Morrison's activities than passive hiding or emergency flight. The memorial service scheduled for next week at Arlington Cemetery, Walsh said carefully, represents both a significant threat and a unique opportunity. Colonel Morrison's presence at that event will bring together everyone involved in current operations related to your former mission, creating the perfect environment for intelligence gathering or elimination of perceived threats. Elena felt her pulse accelerate as she understood the implications of what Walsh was suggesting. The memorial service that was supposed to honor Captain Sarah Chun's sacrifice would become the stage for a confrontation between current intelligence networks and the conspiracy that had caused her death, with Elena herself as both prize and weapon in a conflict that had been brewing for 12 years. What kind of opportunity? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew. The answer from Walsh's expression and the careful way she'd structured the conversation to this point. Walsh glanced around the coffee shop again before responding. with the kind of proposal that would have seemed impossible during Elena's original disappearance, but which current circumstances might make both necessary and achievable. Morrison's operation depends on the assumption that Captain Sarah Chin is dead and her intelligence died with her. Your appearance at the memorial service would not only expose his activities, but provide irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy that forced your disappearance. The suggestion was simultaneously terrifying and appealing, offering Elena the chance to emerge from 12 years of hiding in the most dramatic way possible while creating maximum disruption to hostile operations that had apparently continued throughout her exile. The memorial service would bring together family members, former colleagues, and current military leadership, providing an audience that could ensure her revelations received appropriate attention and protection. What about the risks? Elena asked, though she understood that any action at this point carried enormous dangers regardless of the specific approach they chose to pursue. Walsh's expression reflected the gravity of what she was proposing while acknowledging the very real threats that would accompany such a dramatic revelation. Morrison's network has had 12 years to grow and adapt, and they've demonstrated willingness to eliminate threats through violent means when necessary. Your appearance at the memorial would make you a target for immediate retaliation, possibly including attempts at assassination or kidnapping that could compromise not only your safety, but the safety of everyone attending the ceremony. Elena processed this assessment while considering alternatives that might be less dangerous, but also less effective at neutralizing threats that extended beyond her personal situation. The conspiracy that had forced her into hiding had apparently continued to operate throughout her absence, potentially compromising ongoing military operations and endangering personnel who had no knowledge of the risks they faced. On the other hand, Walsh continued, the public nature of the memorial service and the presence of high-ranking military officials would provide security that might prevent immediate retaliation while ensuring that your revelations couldn't be suppressed or discredited through normal channels. The risk is enormous, but so is the potential for finally eliminating threats that have been growing stronger during your years in hiding. Elena understood that Walsh was presenting her with a choice between continued flight and engagement with enemies who had apparently never stopped searching for ways to eliminate her as a threat to their operations. The decision would determine not only her own fate, but potentially the safety of current military personnel who might be targeted by Morrison's network if their activities remained undetected and unopposed. What kind of support would be available if I chose to attend the memorial? Elena asked, recognizing that her willingness to consider such an option represented a fundamental shift from the passive hiding that had characterized her existence for 12 years. Walsh's response carried the careful precision of someone who'd already analyzed various scenarios and contingencies before making contact with Elena. Limited but potentially effective. Protective surveillance, secure transportation, and emergency extraction capabilities if the situation deteriorates beyond manageable parameters. The goal would be to maximize the impact of your appearance while minimizing opportunities for hostile response. Elena realized that Walsh was describing a military-style operation designed to achieve strategic objectives, while accepting tactical risks that couldn't be eliminated entirely. The fact that such planning had already been conducted suggested that her reappearance had been anticipated by protective assets, who'd maintained contingency plans despite the apparent dissolution of original oversight structures. There's another factor you should consider, Walsh added with the tone of someone presenting information that might influence Elena's decision. Intelligence indicates that Morrison's network is planning their own operation at the memorial service, possibly including attempts to gather information about your former associates or eliminate personnel who might possess knowledge of their activities. Your appearance could disrupt those plans while protecting people who might otherwise become targets. The revelation that Elena's former colleagues and family members might be in danger regardless of her own actions added a new dimension to her decision-making process. The memorial service that was supposed to honor her sacrifice could become a hunting ground for hostile forces seeking to eliminate anyone connected to her former mission, making her attendance a protective measure rather than simply an act of personal vindication. Elena spent several minutes considering the proposal while Walsh waited with the patience of someone who understood that such decisions couldn't be rushed or pressured. The choice between continued hiding and dramatic emergence from exile felt like the most significant decision Elena had faced since her original agreement to disappear, carrying consequences that would reshape not only her own existence, but the lives of everyone connected to her former identity. "If I agree to attend the memorial," Elena said finally, "what would be required in terms of preparation and coordination with protective assets?" Walsh's expression reflected both relief and apprehension as she realized that Elena was seriously considering the proposal despite its obvious dangers and uncertainties. Extensive planning and rehearsal, coordination with security personnel who would need to be briefed on your true identity, and preparation for multiple contingencies depending on how Morrison's network responds to intelligence about your survival. Elena understood that such preparation would require revealing her identity to additional personnel, expanding the circle of people who knew that Captain Sarah Chun had survived and potentially increasing opportunities for information to reach hostile networks before the memorial service took place. The operational security challenges were enormous, but the alternative might be allowing Morrison's operation to succeed in whatever objectives had brought him to the Washington area. "There's one more thing you should know," Walsh said with the careful tone of someone delivering information that might change Elena's assessment of available options. "Recent intelligence suggests that Morrison's network has been attempting to locate and eliminate other personnel who might possess knowledge of their activities during the period when you were active. Your former colleagues have been experiencing unusual scrutiny and investigation that could be preparation for more direct action." The revelation that her former squadron mates might already be under threat from the same network that had forced her into hiding added urgency to Elena's decision-making process. The memorial service represented an opportunity to protect people she'd once served with while exposing threats that had apparently grown more aggressive during her years of absence from official existence. Elena made her decision with the clarity that had once characterized her responses to combat situations where hesitation could prove fatal. "I'll attend the memorial service. What do we need to do to prepare for an operation that could either eliminate this threat permanently or get us all killed in the process?" Walsh nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd hoped for exactly that response while understanding the enormous risks it would entail. "First, we need to get you to a secure location where we can begin planning and preparation without risk of surveillance or interception. Your apartment and workplace are no longer safe, and Morrison's network will be actively searching for any trace of Elena Martinez now that they know she's connected to their former target." Elena felt the familiar sensation of crossing a threshold from which there could be no return, abandoning the safety of anonymity for the dangerous clarity of direct action. The woman who'd learned to be invisible was about to become the most visible person at an event that would determine whether 12 years of hiding had been preparation for victory or merely postponement of inevitable defeat. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Walsh handed Elena a secure communication device that would allow contact with protective assets during the days leading up to the memorial service. "This will connect you directly to operational support if you encounter immediate threats or need emergency assistance. The memorial is scheduled for Saturday morning, which gives us 4 days to prepare for what could be the most important intelligence operation conducted on American soil in the past decade." Elena pocketed the device while scanning the parking lot for signs of surveillance or hostile presence that might indicate Morrison's network had already detected their meeting. The transition from civilian contractor to active intelligence operative felt both natural and terrifying, awakening skills and instincts that had been suppressed for 12 years, but which now seemed essential for survival. "One last question," Elena said as they reached the coffee shop entrance. "What happens if Morrison's network decides that the risks of allowing me to attend the memorial are too great, and they attempt to eliminate the threat before Saturday?" Walsh's expression reflected the cold calculation of someone who'd considered exactly that possibility while planning the operation. "Then we'll discover whether 12 years of hiding has made you rusty or simply given you time to develop new capabilities that your enemies haven't anticipated. Either way, the next 4 days are going to test everything you learned about survival, strategy, and the willingness to risk everything for principles that matter more than personal safety." Elena understood that she was about to discover whether Captain Sarah Chun's skills and instincts had survived 12 years of Elena Martinez's careful anonymity, and whether the woman who'd once been considered one of the military's most effective pilots and intelligence operatives could still function when lives depended on her ability to outthink and outmaneuver enemies who'd spent those same 12 years growing stronger and more dangerous. The drive to the secure location Walsh had designated took Elena through neighborhoods that felt familiar yet alien, suburban communities where normal families lived normal lives, while intelligence operations played out in shadows they never suspected existed. The contrast between civilian routine and the deadly serious game she was about to rejoin felt more pronounced than ever, reminding her of everything she'd given up when she chose to disappear and everything she might be about to lose if Morrison's network proved more capable than current protective assets anticipated. The safe house occupied an unremarkable position in a development of similar homes, its anonymity providing the kind of concealment that had protected Elena for 12 years, but which would soon be abandoned in favor of the most public revelation imaginable. As she parked in the driveway and walked toward a door that opened before she could knock, Elena understood that she was crossing from one life into another, leaving behind Elena Martinez forever and preparing to become Captain Sarah Chun again, in circumstances that would test whether death and resurrection had made her stronger or simply delayed an inevitable reckoning with enemies who'd never stopped hunting her. The next 4 days would determine whether 12 years of exile had been preparation for triumph, or merely an intermission in a conflict that could only end with victory or death, and Elena was no longer certain which outcome would be preferable. If the alternative was continued hiding while others paid the price for her survival. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear over Arlington National Cemetery, with autumn sunlight filtering through ancient oaks that had witnessed decades of solemn ceremonies honoring America's fallen heroes. The memorial service for Captain Sarah Chun was scheduled to begin at 1000 hours, drawing together family members, former colleagues, and military leadership who believed they were gathering to honor a pilot who had died 12 years ago in service to her country. Elena sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked sedan 3 blocks from the cemetery entrance, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. The past 4 days had transformed her from a hidden civilian contractor back into an intelligence operative, whose very existence would soon shatter everything the assembled mourners believed about life, death, and the price of truth in a world where corruption could flourish in shadows. Agent Walsh occupied the driver's seat, coordinating final preparations through an encrypted communication device that connected her to surveillance teams positioned throughout the cemetery grounds. The operation they'd planned would either expose Morrison's network permanently or result in casualties that could include Elena herself, along with innocent family members and colleagues who had no knowledge of the deadly game being played around them. Overwatch confirms Morrison arrived 15 minutes ago with a security detail that exceeds normal protocols for Pentagon officials, Walsh reported quietly. He's positioned himself near the memorial site with clear sight lines to all approaches, suggesting he's prepared for something more significant than a routine ceremony. Elena adjusted the formal military dress uniform she hadn't worn in 12 years, feeling the weight of decorations and rank insignia that represented achievements from a life she'd thought permanently abandoned. The uniform fit perfectly despite the passage of time, thanks to maintenance routines that had kept her in the same physical condition she'd maintained during active service. More importantly, it would provide unmistakable visual confirmation of her identity to everyone present at the memorial. The plan was elegantly simple in concept, but enormously complex in execution. Elena would approach the memorial service during the ceremonial portion when attention was focused on the speakers, emerging from the tree line in full view of assembled guests but positioning herself to avoid immediate confrontation with Morrison's security personnel. Her appearance would create maximum shock and confusion, while providing photographic evidence that Captain Sarah Chun had survived the mission that was supposed to have killed her. Walsh had positioned protective assets throughout the cemetery grounds, ready to respond if Morrison's network attempted immediate retaliation or tried to silence Elena before she could reveal the full scope of the conspiracy that had forced her disappearance. The success of the operation depended on timing, coordination, and Elena's ability to deliver her revelations before hostile forces could react effectively. Final weapons check, Walsh instructed, though Elena had already verified multiple times that her concealed sidearm was loaded and accessible. The weapon felt both familiar and alien in her hands, representing capabilities she'd hoped never to need again, but which circumstances had made essential for survival. Elena's earpiece crackled with updates from surveillance teams monitoring the cemetery approaches and perimeter, confirming that civilian guests were arriving according to schedule, while additional security personnel took positions that suggested preparation for unusual contingencies. Morrison's network had apparently anticipated some form of disruption, though they couldn't have expected the dramatic revelation that Elena was about to provide. At exactly 9:45, Elena stepped out of the sedan and began walking toward Arlington Cemetery with the measured pace of someone approaching a destiny that had been delayed but never abandoned. The morning air carried sounds of military precision and solemn ceremony, bagpipes tuning for traditional honors and honor guard. Units preparing to render final salutes to a pilot they believed had made the ultimate sacrifice for her country. The memorial site occupied a hillside position that provided natural amphitheater seating for assembled guests, with the ceremonial platform positioned to allow clear visibility from multiple directions. Elena could see her parents seated in the front row, aged by 12 years of grief and loss, their faces bearing the weight of mourning a daughter whose death had never been fully explained due to classification requirements. Behind them sat former squadron mates who had advanced in rank and responsibility during Elena's years of hiding, their uniforms displaying decorations earned in conflicts and operations that might have benefited from her participation if circumstances had been different. Major Hayes was among them, her presence confirming that Elena's former conversation partner had maintained interest in developments related to the mysterious contractor who had demonstrated unusual knowledge of military procedures. Colonel Morrison stood near the memorial platform with several associates his bearing suggested security or intelligence backgrounds rather than ceremonial participation. His positioning allowed observation of all approaches while maintaining apparent focus on the proceedings, exactly the kind of tactical awareness Elena would have expected from someone conducting covert operations in a public setting. At 9:58, Elena began her approach from the tree line that bordered the memorial site, walking with the confident stride of an officer reporting for duty rather than someone disrupting a solemn ceremony. Her appearance triggered immediate recognition from family members and former colleagues who had never expected to see her alive, their faces reflecting shock and disbelief that quickly transformed into hope and desperate joy. The bagpiper's rendition of Amazing Grace faltered as the musician noticed the disturbance spreading through the assembled crowd, Conversations erupting despite the formal setting as people struggled to process what they were witnessing. Elena continued her approach, ignoring the chaos her presence was creating while maintaining focus on Morrison, whose expression had shifted from casual observation to alarm and calculation. Elena's mother was the first to break from the seating area, rising with tears streaming down her face as she recognized the daughter she had mourned for 12 years. The reunion that followed would have been touching under different circumstances, but Elena's attention remained divided between family emotions and tactical awareness of Morrison's reaction to her unexpected survival. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena announced in the clear, carrying voice that had once commanded fighter squadrons, "I am Captain Sarah Chun, and I did not die in North Korea 12 years ago. I survived, and I have evidence of the conspiracy that forced my disappearance and endangered the lives of everyone involved in classified operations during that period." The statement created immediate chaos as guests struggled to understand how someone they were mourning could be standing before them alive and unharmed. Military personnel reached for communication devices while family members pressed forward for closer contact, creating the kind of confusion that tactical operations were designed to exploit or avoid depending on objectives. Morrison's response confirmed Elena's suspicions about his true nature and current intentions. Instead of expressing surprise or relief at her survival, he immediately began coordinating with his security detail through discreet hand signals that Elena recognized as preparation for aggressive action. His network had been prepared for exactly this possibility, though they had probably hoped to prevent it through elimination rather than damage control. "Colonel Morrison," Elena called out loudly enough for everyone present to hear, "would you like to explain to these people why you've spent 12 years believing I was dead, while you continued selling classified information to hostile governments?" The accusation hit Morrison's group like a physical blow, causing several of his associates to reach for concealed weapons while others activated communication devices that probably connected them to additional support assets positioned beyond the immediate ceremony area. Elena had achieved her primary objective of exposing Morrison's true nature, but she understood that the most dangerous phase of the operation was just beginning. Morrison's decision to brazen out the confrontation rather than attempting immediate flight suggested confidence in his ability to control the situation through superior numbers or prepared contingencies. His response carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing crises through careful application of force and manipulation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this woman is clearly suffering from psychological trauma related to her captivity," Morrison announced with practiced calm. Captain Chun was indeed presumed killed in action, and her apparent survival is wonderful news that will require extensive debriefing and medical evaluation before we can understand what she experienced during her years of imprisonment. Elena had anticipated exactly this response and had prepared evidence that would be difficult to dismiss or discredit through standard disinformation techniques. She removed the sealed envelope from her uniform jacket, holding it high enough for news cameras that had been alerted to document what they believed was a routine memorial service. This envelope contains copies of classified documents that Morrison sold to North Korean intelligence services 12 years ago, along with financial records proving payment for that information, Elena announced. "The intelligence community has maintained protective custody of this evidence throughout my years in hiding, waiting for an opportunity to present it in circumstances that would ensure appropriate action." The revelation that Elena possessed documentary evidence rather than merely personal testimony shifted the tactical situation significantly, forcing Morrison to choose between immediate flight and aggressive action to prevent the evidence from reaching appropriate authorities. His decision would determine whether the confrontation remained relatively contained or escalated into open violence in front of witnesses and media coverage. Morrison's choice became clear when his security detail began moving to surround Elena. while maintaining the appearance of providing protection rather than establishing control. Their positioning and movement patterns suggested extensive training in crowd control and hostage situations, confirming Elena's assessment that his network had prepared for multiple contingencies, including armed confrontation in public settings. Agent Walsh's voice crackled through Elena's earpiece with urgent coordination instructions as protective assets moved to intercept Morrison's personnel before they could complete their encirclement. Overwatch to Nightingale, hostile movement detected from multiple directions. Recommend immediate extraction to secure perimeter. Elena understood that Walsh was offering her the chance to leave with the evidence intact and the mission accomplished. But she also recognized that immediate departure might leave her family and former colleagues vulnerable to retaliation from Morrison's network. The decision to stay and ensure their protection would increase her own risk while providing additional time for Morrison to implement whatever contingency plans he had prepared for exactly this situation. Negative on extraction. Elena responded quietly, maintaining position until civilian protection is confirmed. The standoff that followed lasted only seconds, but felt like hours as both sides calculated advantages and risks while surrounded by confused civilians who were beginning to understand that they had become participants in something far more dangerous than a memorial service. Elena's uniform and bearing commanded automatic respect from military personnel present, but Morrison's rank and apparent authority created conflicting loyalties among those trying to determine appropriate responses. The resolution came from an unexpected source when Major Hayes stepped forward with the decisive action of someone who had analyzed the situation and reached clear conclusions about where her loyalties belonged. Her movement created the opening that protective assets needed to establish control while providing Elena with cover against immediate retaliation. Morrison's network found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by security personnel who had been positioned throughout the cemetery with specific instructions to prevent exactly the kind of aggressive action they were attempting. The conspiracy that had forced Elena into hiding 12 years ago was finally exposed in the most public way possible, ensuring that justice would no longer be delayed by classification requirements or institutional protection of corrupt officials. As federal agents moved to arrest Morrison and his associates, Elena finally allowed herself to embrace her parents and former colleagues, who had mourned her death and now celebrated her miraculous return. The woman who had learned to be invisible was finally free to exist in the light, knowing that her sacrifice had ultimately protected the people and principles she had sworn to defend. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.